Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to you. My name is Michael Muller. I'm from Denmark, and I'm a former Undersecretary General in the United Nations. I'm currently the chairman of the Diplomacy Forum in the Geneva Science Diplomacy Anticipator. I'm very pleased to be co-chairing this first session of the International Congress for the Governance of AI with my colleague Nanjira Sambuli, a Kenyan researcher, writer, policy analyst, advocacy strategist who works to understand the intersection of information and communications technology adoption with governance, media, entrepreneurship, and culture. Today, and on April 13th, we will explore where we are in the development of the much-needed governance tools for the ethical and legal oversight and governance of powerful AI systems, and what challenges in the governance realm are not yet being addressed adequately. We all know that AI and emerging technologies more broadly hold great promise for humanity's well-being, and yet, if unregulated, can pose serious risks and undesired societal consequences. The profound impacts of new technological applications expose fundamental inadequacies in existing global mechanisms for international collaboration. They highlight their inability to develop new creative approaches that deliver tangible, implementable practices with the urgently required, impactful results in order to urgently address the many existential challenges we're facing, including the deep and growing inequalities in our societies. AI and other cutting-edge technologies challenge existing structures and mindsets and require us all to work towards new and much more effective models for international cooperation. Hence, the title of our session today, Catalyzing Cooperation: Can the AI Governance Initiatives Work Together? It is very much our hope and ambition that the presentations in today's session and the discussions in our second session on April 13th will help us move further towards that goal. After opening remarks by the Interim United Nations Tech Envoy, Maria Francesca Spatolisano, there will be a few short welcoming greetings by the organizers of the ICGAI, including by the lead organizer of the Congress, Wendell Wallach, who will delve a little deeper into the background and intentions of the ICGAI. We have a number of great, high-level, diverse, and very knowledgeable speakers today, and I want to thank them all very much for having agreed to participate in our Congress. And it is now my great pleasure to hand the floor over to my co-chair, Nanjira Sambuli. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It is a pleasure to be co-chairing this important gathering. In addition to the international and global governance mechanisms we need for artificial intelligence, as Michael has pointed out, we must pay special attention to whose experiences and worldviews get to shape them. The world is highly unequal, as we know, and power and resources are unevenly distributed to ensure, and this is challenging in ensuring that AI is conceptualized, developed, and deployed in a manner that maximizes benefits and opportunities while minimizing harms and risks. So to that point, inclusion or inclusivity is a fundamental principle for shaping artificial intelligence itself, as well as its consequent governance mechanisms. Inclusion or exclusions span geography, sectors, gender, age, just to name a few. And all these must be given important consideration throughout our deliberations. The multi-stakeholder governance approach that is often talked about does hold promise for making AI governance more inclusive, as we will see and hear from diverse perspectives throughout the Congress in today's session and the session on April 13th. We absolutely need inclusive, equitable deliberation tables, and I hope that these discussions during this Congress contribute positively to that. Looking very much to today's discussions. Thank you, Michael. Over to you. Michael, you may want to unmute.
Sorry about that, I keep doing that. Thank you very much. So it's my pleasure to kick us off with a pre-recorded message from United Nations Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, Maria Francesca Spatolisano, who is the officer in charge of the Office of the UN Envoy on Technology, and she's a former European Union ambassador to the OECD and to UNESCO.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, distinguished participants. I would like to begin by thanking the Congress organizers for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm especially grateful to speak after my distinguished former UN colleague and Congress co-chair, Michael Mueller, who has been a pillar of the United Nations system and continues to contribute his time and effort to our work. I speak to you today in my capacity as officer in charge of the Office of the Envoy on Technology at the United Nations. This office was established by the Secretary General to support the implementation of his roadmap for digital cooperation and to bring together all stakeholders to better harness the potential of technology while addressing its challenges. The ways in which artificial intelligence or AI will change our lives are limitless. AI technologies are being used in everything from commercial services to public services, in areas as diverse as education, healthcare, infrastructure, and much more. Its transformative character can enable rapid economic and social progress, helping us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. However, like many other technologies, AI is not neutral. For example, AI can amplify existing biases. It often discriminates based on its limited training and may help spreading misinformation, hate speech, and violent content. These are not challenges of AI technology we can afford to ignore, but they are also not faults we must live with. This is why there are many ongoing governance initiatives, like the OECD Policy Observatory, the Global Partnership on AI, and this one, the International Congress for the Governance of AI. Naturally, much work still needs to be done to create inclusive, responsive, and effective global cooperation structures that can meet the challenges posed by AI. In particular, we need to ensure greater representation from the South and developing countries, as most of the voices in global AI discussions are from the North, the global North. This is where the United Nations can play an important role in bringing all concerned, governments, the private sector, civil society, academia, and the technology community to the same table to work together. As the Secretary General of the United Nations has frequently emphasized, how we address the challenges of the digital world is one of the key issues of our time. He has thus launched a roadmap for digital cooperation, which lays out a vision on key digital issues such as universal connectivity, digital human rights, and digital inclusion. The roadmap was developed after extensive multi-stakeholder and cross-regional consultations. It contains a series of action-oriented and concrete steps to take forward the recommendations of the Secretary General's own high-level panel on digital cooperation, which the Office of the Tech Envoy is now leading through partnerships with key UN entities and stakeholders. In his roadmap, the Secretary General specifically stresses artificial intelligence as an area that needs greater global steerage. The Secretary General thus proposes that he would establish at the United Nations the truly global and representative international body in this area, a multi-stakeholder advisory body on global AI cooperation to address issues around inclusion, coordination, and capacity building. The AI body will help share and promote best practices, as well as exchange views on artificial intelligence standardization, and compliance efforts. It will also provide guidance on artificial intelligence that is trustworthy, human rights based, safe and sustainable, and promotes peace. These are the key questions that go to the heart of the challenges we face with AI, ensuring that this technology is used in ways that are positive and ethical, environmentally sound, and respect and protect human rights. For example, how can we ensure that the use of AI technology does not perpetuate existing biases and disproportionately impact different groups? What safeguards do we need to put in place to ensure that AI is used in positive ways and does not, contribute to misinformation, deepen divisions, and stir conflicts? I hope that discussions at this Congress can shed some light on these key issues. And I am pleased to note, for instance, that the Congress has a session on trustworthy AI. The Secretary General's proposal for a multi-stakeholder advisory body is part of the important work being done by the broader UN family on the issue of AI. For instance, UNESCO is working on global AI ethics standardization, ITU on building capacity for AI for good, and UNICEF on AI for children. The Secretary General has also called for a ban on the use of lethal autonomous weapons as machines with the power to kill on their own without human judgment and accountability that are bringing us into unacceptable moral and political territory. The Office of the Technology Envoy works closely with all UN agencies on these AI issues, as well as on the broader implementation of the Secretary General's roadmap. We will also continue consultations on developing the Secretary General's AI multi-stakeholder advisory body to ensure that the body is impactful and relevant in the already crowded and active AI space. Given the UN's unique convening role and universal legitimacy, I remain convinced that this is where many of these important issues must be discussed. Of all the emerging technologies, artificial intelligence stands unique as one with the greatest potential to empower, but also to disrupt. This is why the stakes for international cooperation is greatest here. The fact that the AI moves faster than normative and regulatory frameworks only further underscores the urgency. AI will be an essential tool in our journey towards a prosperous future. I would like to conclude by inviting you and the broader AI community to share its knowledge and expertise in the UN work streams that we have established to implement the Secretary General roadmap, in particular in the areas where we address the impact of artificial intelligence. I know that some of you are already engaging with us in this important work. My office is your entry point to contribute to our collective efforts to build a more inclusive and fairer digital world together. I thank you.
And now it is my pleasure to hand over the floor to Jim Clark, who is one of the organizers of this Congress and founder of the World Technology Network. Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Najira. 2 decades ago, I founded the World Technology Network to identify and highlight and create a global community around the most innovative and impactful work in science and technology and related fields. Soon after, we launched the annual World Technology Awards, including notably the World Technology Award for Ethics. In 2014, I presented Wendell Wallach with that award, and so began a wonderful friendship. In 2018, Wendell and I began our collaboration to create the International Congress for the Governance of AI, building on his long-standing ideas about what was needed. We held very well-attended and high-level planning meetings during the UN General Assembly in 2018 and 2019, as well as elsewhere. And to consider and develop proposals, ICGAI also held a series of high-level expert working group workshops, in particular in partnership with the Observer Research Foundation in Delhi, India, the Assuring the Safety of Autonomous Systems program at York University in London, and the Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford University, the last workshop from which emerged the most comprehensive proposal for a global governance network for AI, about which Wendell will discuss at the close of today's event. As almost all of you know, the goal all along was to hold the ICGAI as a physical event this past April in Prague, thanks to the foresight and generosity of the city of Prague and its mayor, from whom you will hear in a moment. I would be remiss if I did not also mention the other cities who also offered to host: The Hague, Hong Kong, and Singapore. We thank them all. We could not have predicted the global pandemic, causing us to reschedule only weeks before the in-person event. We believe that we've captured the main ideas and spirit of that event as we now commence today with our ongoing ICGAI virtual event series. We've been supported in this virtually all-volunteer collective global effort by many people and organizational partners. A wonderful list you can explore further on the icgai.org website, including our almost 100 expert advisors and the original lineup of speakers for the 3-day Prague event, and also with the ongoing logistical support of Volha Levitnets. Thank you. And finally, and certainly not least, we've been supported way beyond the call of duty in partnership with the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs under the wise leadership of Joel Rosenthal, who we will also hear from in a moment. On behalf of the ICGAI, we thank all of you who have brought us to this point and will take the possibilities inherent in ICGAI even further. Now it is my great pleasure to welcome for brief remarks His Honor, the Mayor of the magical city of Prague.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear genuine supporters of artificial intelligence, let me welcome you to the first event from the ICGAI series. As you know, we were very much looking forward to receiving you all in Prague last year. Sadly, the pandemic had different plans and, like many others, eventually we decided to go online. This opening event starts an important discussion on comprehensive governance of AI. The City of Prague, a founding member of the Prague AI Initiative, is committed to employing AI-based solutions and technologies for the benefit of the citizens. At the same time, it is our duty to put in place mechanisms to prevent negative impacts such as violation of human rights. In other words, we have to make sure that the AI we and others use is an ethical one. I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the ICGAI team, the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, the World Technology Network, and all our distinguished advisors and speakers for all their hard work and commitment. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a very productive event today, and please remember, when it comes to AI ethics, Prague is here to help.
Thank you, Mayor. And finally, I would like to welcome a man who, without whose organization, the Carnegie Council, and personal support and patience, we would not be meeting here today, Joel Rosenthal.
Thanks, Jim. Only sorry that we're not meeting in Prague, but it's delightful to see all of you here online. So I hope we can get to Prague sometime soon. I just want to add my warm welcome to all of you from the Carnegie Council in New York City. We're very pleased to be co-conveners of this International Congress. This Congress is suitably ambitious for our council, and it's in keeping with our historic legacy and also our ambitions for the future. Let me just say a word about our council. We seek to generate ethical solutions to global scale challenges. For over 100 years, we've acted as a nonpartisan and independent organization, trusted to set the ethical agenda. Our mission is educational and action-oriented. We identify ethical issues. We convene leading experts like all of you. We communicate to a global audience, and we connect communities and build networks around shared interests and common values. Throughout our history, we've convened diverse voices and leaders, asked hard questions, and explored the shared interests needed to develop a set of principles for the common good. We've moved conversations out of the echo chambers and into the global public square, where all voices are welcome and respected. And finally, we've aspired to engage audiences and build constituencies, and to empower ethical action around the world. This is exactly what we're doing today, and we're grateful to all of you for joining the effort. We're also grateful to the leadership of this project, including Jim Clark, who did so much of the organizing, and our Carnegie Council Senior Fellow, Wendell Wallach. Now, most of you know Wendell for his path-breaking work on moral machines and the governance of emerging technologies. We at Carnegie Council are delighted to have him as our Senior Fellow for this project and our new project called Artificial Intelligence and Equality Initiative. Wendell's been the architect and engine for so much of this work and so much of the discussion that we're having today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to him. Wendell, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joel. Planning for an international Congress for the governance of artificial intelligence actually dates back 5 years now. In calling this a Congress, there was no illusion of legislative authority. The initiative was motivated over concerns voiced by scholars, leaders of civil society, and a few policy planners about the mismatch between the speed at which innovative technologies are deployed and government's ability to put in place effective ethical legal oversight. Technologies would become entrenched before governments would address risks and undesired societal consequences. When this initiative was started, there were, of course, international meetings around regulating fintech, managing cyber insecurity, and at the UN in Geneva, proposals to enact a treaty to restrict deployment of lethal autonomous weapons, but very little else. A lot has changed over 5 years. By some counts, there are more than 150 lists of principles for guiding the responsible development and deployment of AI. The conversation has moved from principles to practices and policies for their realization. A plethora of international governance initiatives has emerged, and the pandemic has sped up and underscored existing trends. On the one hand, life on the screen has made the pandemic bearable, kept economies from collapsing, and biotech and AI have sped up the development of vaccines. The digital economy has expanded at an exponential rate, and those of us able to invest in tech companies have prospered, while hundreds of millions of lives have been devastated. More troubling are the ways that AI and the digital economy continue to exacerbate structural inequalities and give rise to new inequities. Unfortunately, talk of AI for good and AI ethics can obscure this fact, can facilitate ethics washing, and distracts attention to a very troubling trend. As Joel mentioned, at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International, this concern led Anya Kasperson and myself to initiate the AI and Equality Initiative. The AI revolution must be nudged onto a more positive trajectory to ensure its benefits far outweigh the risks and undesired consequences, and that we bequeath a world worth living in to our children. Changes have forced us to be agile as to what functions the International Congress for the Governance of AI might yet serve. The Planning Committee decided upon an online event that addresses issues and governance concerns that are not being adequately given attention. Those have already been touched upon by Michael Muller and Nanjira Sambuli, but let me repeat the key ones. First, lack of an effective instrument to facilitate cooperation between governance initiatives. AI touches all facets of life, so distributed governance is natural. But how do we ensure that distributed governance does not deteriorate into politics as usual and a cacophony of competing voices, particularly on those international issues where agreement is essential? Secondly, there's much talk of the need for multi-stakeholder input. Yet today one often witnesses patronizing inclusivity where those in power decide who speaks for the rest of humanity. How can we create meaningful inclusivity and bottom-up engagement in the governance of the bio-digital revolution? And third, multilateralism is faltering and the public is losing confidence and trust that national governments and international institutions can solve their problems. Can we reimagine and reinvent international governance for the 21st century? A few of our speakers today are identified with specific international governance initiatives. However, we also gave particular attention to featuring leaders who span initiatives and think comprehensively about ways to address the international governance of artificial intelligence. Most of you are undoubtedly suffering from Zoom fatigue, but we trust that you will find this to be a particularly valuable event. Thank you for your attention, and over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Wendell. Thank you very much, and for setting us on the right course here. It's now my pleasure to introduce Doris Leuthard, former president of the Swiss Federation from 2010 to 2017. She's a member of the Club of Madrid. She was a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation, and she's today the president of the Swiss Digital Initiatives. She also happens to serve with me on the Kofi Annan Foundation, so I'm particularly happy to have a colleague with us today. She's going to be delivering a pre-recorded message for us.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure that I can join you for this very important conference, Governance on AI. We all know digital technologies are rapidly transforming society, simultaneously allowing for unprecedented advances in the human condition and giving rise to profound new challenges. Growing opportunities created by the application of digital technologies are paralleled by stark abuses and unintended consequences. Digital dividends coexist with digital divides. Algorithms can do good and bad. And as technological change has accelerated also during the pandemic, the mechanisms for cooperation and governance of this landscape have failed to keep pace. Divergent approaches and ad hoc responses threaten to fragment the interconnectedness that defines the digital age, leading to competing standards and approaches, lessening trust and discouraging cooperation. We have to craft a path that will lead us to a more secure and sustainable system of global cooperation and renewed multilateral institutions, fit for purpose on the 21st century and resilient against future disasters and challenges. Sensing the urgency on the moment, in July 2018, the UN Secretary General appointed a high-level panel to consider the questions of digital cooperation and ways we work together in order to maximize their benefits and to minimize the risk. I had the honor to be a member of this panel. And we all know it's not easy to give an answer, and there are today different approaches. We see people in Silicon Valley saying technology will solve the problem, we should trust the technology. We see Chinese government who has more and more control over the data of their citizens, others who intervene in having access to the internet. What is clear is that we need an improved digital cooperation, and that we live in the age of digital interdependence. Effective digital cooperation requires that multilateralism is strengthened. Despite some strains, there is no other way. No one country alone, no one company or organization alone can fix the issue. Multilateral cooperation is not an option, it is essential in the future. It is essential to preservation of our social values and the resolution of transnational challenges like digital transformation as a whole. It also requires that multilateralism be complemented by multi-stakeholderism, a cooperation that involves not only governments and not only tech experts, but far more. We have to include the whole spectrum of other stakeholders like technologists, civil society, academia, and the private sector. We need to bring far more voices to the table until we get the best results. This will not be easy because most governments are not used to that. They lose a little bit of power by this cooperation. In Switzerland, we have a long tradition in such cooperation and participating processes. And we made very good results with that, because citizens who can raise their voice to every law are better informed. And finally, the government, and this means society at the end of the day, has a better result because people are involved, can say their opinion, and this is finally a better solution. This change will not be easy, but we have to go in this direction. The same counts for multilateral institutions and international cooperation. They require increased participation, inclusion, capacity of all. A claim who was recently also addressed by the Club of Madrid, the former presidents and prime ministers. We need a forward-looking, viable, and people-centered strategy of pragmatic dialogue, solidarity, and trust. Trust will be crucial. Trust of consumers and users are essential. If we look back in the history, in the past, it was regulation standards who created this trust level. Think of the food industry, of the pharmaceutical products, or of cars. For all these companies, it was only possible by a level of trust created by common standards, international cooperation, to go global and to have also a global market. To support the consumer and the user, we in Switzerland, by the Swiss Digital Initiative, we have an element which could also lead to more governance and more transparency, the digital trust label. We think that it must be very simple to know as a user what is the level of trust, what are the indicators to count on trust, And our label can give orientation and is a fast way for the user to make a distinction, and he has not to read manuals or hundreds of articles from the company. We don't need to read all these different technological approaches, so a label can be an element of governance and could also influence the design of future products. What helps is that it is a fact that universal human rights apply equally online and offline. But there is a need to examine how time-honored human rights framework and conventions should guide digital cooperation and digital technologies. In AI, we know how difficult this can be. We need society-wide conversations about boundaries, norms, and shared aspirations for the use of AI, including complicated issues like privacy, human agency, security, or liability. Also, this is a very different and difficult task. The Club of Madrid recently said, we call for a globally agreed set of norms and measures to enable improved global connectivity and data flows, inclusive digital platforms, and better internet management. We need a Bretton Woods for digitalization. This would mean a totally new architecture. AI influences a lot of developments, and we know there are also tensions today, technology tensions between states, creating tensions then on the political level. A global order helps to accompany technology developments, to set standards, to benchmark practices, protocols for interoperability and validation, measures for data security and protection, guarantees for individual rights, and the definition of public goods to have equal conditions for researchers and companies. A globally agreed set of norms is possible and should lead to a UN Charter where all these principles, norms, standards are globally agreed. This would be my dream. We can draw on many thoughtful reflections and reports in this respect, and values also that are generally accepted in today's world, like inclusiveness, respect, human-centeredness, transparency, accessibility, sustainability, collaboration. All these values can also be applicable in the cyberspace. Ladies and gentlemen, it is up to us now to go in the future towards this new architecture. In the panel I mentioned, we elaborated 3 possible models, 3 possible future architectures. And we did not propose a new organization because this normally takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. We can build on existing platforms and organizations, like, for example, our first model, the IGF+, the Internet Governance Forum in Geneva. It can be optimized to the needs of today. Or we can go also to other solutions, like a co-governance architecture, or as a third way, a digital commons architecture. I don't go here in details of these 3 models, but the Secretary General of the UN published a roadmap, and we can go in this direction only step by step. I invite you to discuss which model of governance of architecture could be possible. May it be AI, may it be in general, all questions on internet and our data society. Time will be crucial. If we continue only to talk, to make a lot of reports, We lose power and others will make the profit. So I think we should begin because we know every structure can be optimized. We know we can also fail with some elements. But let's begin the new architecture of the 21st century, that we can accompany AI, that we can give them also legal certainty, orientation, what we like, what we don't like, what is legal, and what can be problematic. Thank you so much. Enjoy the Congress.
Thank you to Doris Leuthard, an important statement, and that sets us even stronger, more strongly on the path of where we're going. It's now my pleasure to introduce Lord Clement Jones, also in a video presentation. He is the former chair of the House of Lords Select Committee on AI. He's a co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on AI, and he's a founding member of the OECD Parliamentary Group on AI and a member of the Council of Europe Ad Hoc Committee on AI.
Hello, and it's great to be with you. Today, I'm going to try and answer questions such as what kind of international AI governance is needed? Can we build on existing mechanisms? Or does some new body need to be created? As the House of Lords in our follow-up report, AI in the UK, No Room for Complacency, last December strongly emphasised, it's never been clearer, particularly after this year of COVID and our ever greater reliance on digital technology, that we need to retain public trust in the adoption of AI, particularly in its more intrusive forms, and that this is a shared issue internationally. To do that, we need, whilst realizing the opportunities, to mitigate the risks involved in the application of AI. And this brings with it the need for clear standards of accountability. 2019 was the year of the formulation of high-level ethical principles in the field of AI by the OECD, EU, and G20. These are very comprehensive and provide the basis for a common set of international standards. For instance, they all include the need for explainability of decisions and an ability to challenge them, a process made more complex when decisions are made in the so-called black box of neural networks. But it's become clear that voluntary ethical guidelines, however much they're widely shared, are not enough to guarantee ethical AI. And there comes a point where the risks attendant on non-compliance with ethical principles is so high that policymakers need to accept that certain forms of AI development and adoption require enhanced governance and/or regulation. And the key factor in 2020 has been the work done at international level in the Council of Europe, OECD, and EU towards putting these principles into practice in an approach to regulation which differentiates between different levels of risk and takes this into account when regulatory measures are formulated. Last spring, the European Commission published its white paper on the proposed regulation of AI by a principle-based legal framework targeting high-risk AI systems. As the white paper says, a risk-based approach is important to help ensure that the regulatory intervention is proportionate. However, it requires clear criteria to differentiate between the different AI applications, in particular in relation to the question or not of whether they are high risk. The determination of what is a high risk AI application should be clear and easily understandable and applicable for all parties concerned. In the autumn, the European Parliament adopted its framework for ethical AI to be applicable to AI, robotics, and related technologies developed, deployed, and/or used within the EU. And like the Commission's white paper, this proposal also targets high-risk AI. And as well as the social and environmental aspects notable in this proposed ethical framework is the emphasis on human oversight required to achieve certification. Looking through the lens of human rights, including democracy and the rule of law, the Council of Europe's Ad Hoc Committee on AI, GGN-AI, last December drew up a feasibility study for regulation of AI, which likewise advocates a risk-based approach to regulation. It considers the feasibility of a legal framework for AI and how that might best be achieved. As the study says, these risks, however, depend on the application context, technology, and stakeholders involved. To counter any stifling of socially beneficial AI innovation and to ensure that the benefits of this technology can be reaped fully while adequately tackling its risks, the GGN-AI recommends that a future Council of Europe legal framework on AI should pursue a risk-based approach targeting the specific application context. And work is now ongoing to draft binding and non-binding instruments to take the study forward. If, however, we aspire to a risk-based regulatory and governance approach, we need to be able to calibrate the risk, which will determine what level of governance we need to go to. But as has been well illustrated during the COVID pandemic, the language of risk is fraught with misunderstanding. When it comes to AI technologies, we need to assess the risks by reference to the nature of AI applications and the context of their use. The potential impact and probability of harm, the importance and sensitivity of use of data, the application within a particular sector, the affected stakeholders, the risk of non-compliance, and whether a human in the loop mitigates risk to any degree. And in this respect, the detailed and authoritative classification work carried out by another international initiative, the OECD Network of AI Experts Working Group, so-called One AI, on the classification of AI systems, comes at a crucial and timely point. And this gives policymakers a simple lens through which to view the deployment of any particular AI system. Its classification uses 4 dimensions: context, i.e. sector, stakeholder, purpose, etc., data and input, AI model, i.e. neural or linear, supervised or unsupervised, and tasks and output, i.e. what does the AI do? And it ties in well with the Council of Europe feasibility work. When it comes to AI technologies, we need to assess the risk by reference to the nature of the AI applications and their use. And this kind of calibration, a clear governance hierarchy, can be followed depending on the level of risk assessed. Where the risk is relatively low, a flexible approach such as a voluntary ethical code without a hard compliance mechanism can be envisaged, such as those enshrined in the international ethical codes mentioned earlier. Where the risk is a step higher, enhanced corporate governance using business guidelines and standards with clear disclosure and compliance mechanisms needs to be instituted. Already at international level, we have guidelines on government best practice, such as the AI procurement guidelines developed by the World Economic Forum, and these have been adopted by the UK government. Finally, we may need to introduce comprehensive regulation, such as that which is being adopted for autonomous vehicles, which is enforceable by law. Given the way the work of all these organizations is converging, the key question, of course, is whether on the basis of this kind of commonly held ethical evaluation and risk classification and assessment, there are early candidates for regulation, and to what extent this can or should be internationally driven. Concern about the use of live facial recognition technologies is becoming widespread, with many US cities banning its use and proposals for its regulation under discussion in the EU and the UK. Of concern too are technologies involving deep fakes and algorithmic decision-making in sensitive areas such as criminal justice and financial services. The debate over hard and soft law in this area is by no means concluded, but there is no doubt that pooling expertise at international level could bear fruit. A common international framework informed by the work so far of the high-level panel on digital cooperation, the UN Human Rights Council and their AI for Good platform, and brokered by UNESCO, where an expert group has been working on a recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. The ITU of the UN itself, which in 2019 established a Centre for Artificial Intelligence and Robotics in the Netherlands, could be created. And this could gain public trust through establishing that adopters are accountable for high-risk AI applications, and at the same time allay concerns that AI and other digital technologies are being overregulated. Given that our aim internationally on AI governance must be to ensure that the cardinal principle is observed that AI needs to be our servant, not our master, there is cause for optimism that experts, policymakers, and regulators now recognize that they have a duty to ensure that whatever solution they adopt, they recognize ascending degrees of AI risk, and the policies and solutions are classified and calibrated accordingly. Regulators themselves are now becoming more of a focus. Our House of Lords report recommended regulator training in AI ethics and risk assessment, and I believe that this will become the norm. But even if at this juncture we cannot yet identify a single body to take the work forward, there is clearly a growing common international AI agenda, and especially, I hope, with the Biden administration coming much more into the action, we can all expect further progress in 2021. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also a very important statement, and very interesting to see the many different activities that are happening all over the place that we need to connect to. We need to connect the dots. It's now my pleasure to introduce Danit Gal, Associate Fellow at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge, Visiting Research Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at the Nanyang Technological University, and she previously led the AI portfolio in the implementation of the UN Secretary General's Roadmap for Digital Cooperation as a technology advisor. Danit, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you today. Building on really the excellent talks from previous distinguished speakers, we can all agree that the AI governance initiatives mentioned today are truly commendable in their efforts to advance discourse on the regulatory methods and instruments needed to govern AI. But we still have a very long way to go, and many experts, including myself, are increasingly concerned that we're not necessarily going in the best possible direction. Echoing Doris, calls for multi-stakeholder-based international cooperation are essential, but we must put them into action to include those who depend on access to these initiatives the most. This brief talk builds on the promising work presented by previous speakers and sheds further light on the most pressing challenge these international AI governance initiatives face to date, being inclusive. In order to effectively govern, we must do so inclusively. While governments, for the most part, truly govern in the full sense of the word, many other stakeholders are essential for successful and effective AI governance. It is also important that we remember that AI cannot be contained by geopolitical borders, making it effectively everyone's problem. This poses considerable challenge to national, regional, and international level governance efforts. While domestic regulations must respond to local values and needs, regional and international level regulations need to be flexible enough to encompass a wide variety of values and needs without being too vague. For this reason, people tend to assume that the more stakeholders they have around the table, the more complicated finding consensus on AI governance becomes, and thus the less effective their efforts become. Conversely, many existing AI governance initiatives start out by identifying those with shared values and needs, so they can more easily reach initial consensus and then add other countries that agree to align with such existing consensus. These misconceptions, among others, limit robust global participation in AI governance initiatives and erect barriers, often false barriers, to meaningful participation further down the line. As a result, inclusive AI governance often appears as an afterthought for existing initiatives and has yet to truly materialize in most of them. To be sure, there are many other barriers to inclusive and representative participation in AI governance initiative that need our urgent attention and care. This has been made abundantly clear in almost every conversation about international cooperation on AI governance, and most recently highlighted by the AI Inequality Initiative established by the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs to address exactly this pressing challenge. But even if we are able to overcome these aforementioned barriers in time, the prospects of meaningful, inclusive AI governance initiatives is diminishing by the minute. If this current trajectory of intentional and unintentional exclusion persists, these initiatives run the risk of transforming into walled regulatory gardens by the time outstanding global actors, namely from the global south, come knocking on their doors. And if there's a lesson that developed countries leading current AI governance initiatives would do well to learn from the painful experience of internet access in the developing world, is that walled gardens do more to stifle progress, innovation, and cooperation than open access. On a brighter note, however, earlier today I moderated a panel consisting of experts and representatives from the aforementioned initiatives, and I'm greatly encouraged by the many steps initiatives like GPay, the Council of Europe, and the OECD are taking. Inclusive engagements are also at the heart of established expert participation platforms that are powered by UN agencies like ITU, UNESCO, UNICEF, and UNICRI, as well as other entities building on the work of the high-level panel for digital cooperation and realizing the resulting Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation, like the Office of the Technology Envoy. All of the above are making room for underrepresented experts at their tables, and it is essential that we support them in doing so. But there's so much more that needs to be done. The main takeaway this talk offers is that genuine global cooperation on AI governance can and should assume a decentralized form, where many initiatives coexist and cooperate to shed light on different perspectives and approaches that foster equal consideration and discussion. A reality where Western-based norms and principles are considered as international guidelines and standards is not just unrealistic, it is unreasonable and risky, particularly for those in the global South. In order to fully govern AI across borders and political interests, we must do everything in our power to support as many channels of engagement as possible, to bring together a diversity of stakeholders from around the world. We must involve different societies, cultures, beliefs, and values to ensure AI is not only used to the benefit of the whole of humanity, but also governed to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danit. An important statement from you, and I, of course, agree 100%. No, I agree 1,000% on the imperative for inclusion and to not continue these divisive practices that we've had for so many years. It's now my pleasure to introduce and give the floor to Raja Chatila, Professor Emeritus at the Pierre and Marie Curie University, former Director of the Institute of Intelligent Systems and Robotics, and of the Laboratory of Excellence on Human-Machine Interaction. He's the chair of the IEEE Global Initiative for Ethical Considerations in AI and Autonomous Systems, and the co-chair of the Global Partnership on AI Working Group on Responsible AI. Raja, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I will add another aspect to another facet to the multi-stakeholder initiatives that are going on. So I will speak about the GPay or GPay. First, you have heard about several initiatives, several groups that come up with recommendation. The OECD, of course, the Council of Europe, and the OECD continuing work in the framework of One AI, the World Economic Forum, which is providing a lot of documentation and very interesting material for, again, multi-stakeholder reflection and specifically companies. There is also something which is really important because it stems from the community itself, the community which is building AI systems, which is building the technology. It's the engineers, IEEE International organization, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, which started in 2016, the Global Initiative on Ethics of Autonomous and Intelligent Systems, and produced a document, Ethically Aligned Design. Because indeed, what we want to do is to empower all the stakeholders and also the persons who are building those systems to be able to prioritize ethical values when developing those systems. And practically speaking, and I think this is very important, it has been mentioned, we need tools to ensure that those systems are actually aligned with our values. And practical tools are, for example, standards. So 15 standards are under development in the IEEE Standard Association, stemming from this initiative that embed ethical design. And of course, there is, when you speak about standards, you need to certify that those standards are indeed inside using the systems are actually using those standards. So there's also a certification program, ICGAI, that ensures that there is indeed this compliance. And also, you need to make sure that people, those who are building the systems, but also more generally, all the stakeholders are educated. So there is also an education program to enable this. But today, I would like to focus on another global initiative, another global framework. This GPA, the Global Partnership on AI. So the GPA is, as you probably know, started from an initiative between France and Canada, and then inside the G7, and then was launched in June 2020 with 15 countries. And soon, by the end of 2024, other countries joined. And as you can see, it's an international community. And the important thing also is that this initiative is very much connected to the OECD. The mission of the GPI is actually to support, guide the responsible adoption of AI that is grounded in human rights, inclusion, diversity, innovation, economic growth, and societal benefits, while seeking to address the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So the global overview that you see here is that we bring together people from scientific community, experts from industry, from the civil society, from governments, from international organizations, and organize them into working group so that they feed the reflection with their expertise, and they can start initiatives for cross-sectoral, multi-stakeholder collaboration. And most importantly, and this is really I would say, the central issue, is bridging the gap between theory and practice. We have come up with several principles, and many of these principles converge. And this is, of course, good news. But we need to put them in practice, and therefore we need some actual grounded projects to do that. And of course, it's related to the SDGs, which means we have to take into account emerging developing countries' situations and build on existing work. So this is the multilateralism that I believe Doris Lettern has spoken about, that Mrs. Spatolisano has spoken about. And now, as I said, it's very much connected to the OECD, and actually the basis for being part of the GPA is to agree on the OECD principles for responsible stewardship of trustworthy AI. So there is a close connection. And of course, the OECD has its own process with the One AI groups that Lord Clement Jones mentioned, but there is this shared principles and exchange of and cooperation. So the organization of the GPI, there is a council, high-level council with, of course, member states' involvement, and then a steering committee, which includes elected people from the multi-stakeholder expert group and also government representatives. And the secretariat is hosted at the OECD. The multi-stakeholder experts are divided into 5 working groups. The working group on responsible AI with a specific subgroup on AI and pandemic response. Of course, this started during the COVID crisis, so it was very important to also address this problematic. Another working group on data governance, a working group on future of work, and this is of great importance, as you know, the impact of AI on society involves, of course, the transformation of work, and a working group on innovation and commercialization. And there are 2 expertise centers, one in Montreal and one in Paris, to support the work of these working groups. The working groups are co-chaired by 2 persons each, I have the honor to co-chair with Yoshua Benjo from Canada, the Responsible AI Working Group. There is the data governance with Maya Bukataj-Stanchik from Slovenia and Jenny Tennyson from the UK. Future of Work is Willem Boer from Germany and Yuko Harayama from Japan. Innovation Commercialization, François Soulier-Fogelman and François Gagné, French and Canada. And the AI and Pandemic Response with Elise Hae-Yun Oh from Korea and Paul Swittens from Belgium. So just to give you an idea about concrete work, and that's my last slide, the focus of the Responsible AI Working Group specifically is actually to contribute to the responsible development, governance, and use of AI systems in a human-centered way and in congruence with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So since we were launched in June 2020, we have reviewed national, international initiatives and identified areas of action. And these are the 5 areas for action within this working group. Facilitated intergovernmental cooperation on AI governance. What can we do to facilitate this intergovernmental cooperation on AI governance? This is a really hard question. Governance of social media, given the importance that social media play in our daily lives, but also its impact, for example, on democracy. We need to imagine governance means so that these social media are compliant with our values and protect our democracy. And 3 actually targeting the Sustainable Development Goals. One is on climate change and biodiversity, AI for climate change and for addressing climate change and increasing biodiversity, AI for public domain drug discovery, and AI for education and literacy. So the working groups actually are not going to develop specific AI project, but they are going to develop the roadmap. What should be done? How could this be done? And this will be leveraged afterwards in concrete projects in international collaboration. Thank you for your attention.
Take this as an opportunity. You said there is a lot of concern.
Hello. Thank you very much, Professor. It is now my pleasure to introduce another video participation by Shui Lan, who is the director of the Institute of AI International Governance and professor and dean of the Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important conference. Today, I'm going to talk about the Chinese view on global governance for AI. I think, first of all, in terms of what are the AI governance, what are the critical elements, from our view. We first of all, of course, it's what are the key values to pursue in the governance of AI, and also through what system, what regimes that we go through about governing AI, and also actors, object, and also what is the outcome of the AI governance. The second element I think we focus on is who are the key players and tools in governing AI. Of course, we recognize the key players are the private sectors, particularly the companies that develops and applies AI. And here I think they use various tools in terms of the ethical principles, the internal committees, and also technical tools. And also I think the public sector plays a very important role that providing the overall principles, and also I think develop various kind of legislations and also government policies. The social sector also here plays an important role in terms of voicing their views and also engaging in various communications. And finally, of course, international organizations plays a critical role in coordinating different countries in setting up international platforms for dialogue and communication. I think one thing that we need to recognize that in terms of the AI governance at the moment, the so-called regime complex phenomenon, that is, we have many players in this AI governance system, but there's no clear, sort of dominance of one organization versus the other. So everyone have some stakes in it and some overlapping, but there's not a clear structure and hierarchy at all. So I think we need to work hard to really try to sort this out to make sure that our AI governance at the global level is efficient and effective. Also, in terms of, in AI governance, the two major concerns. One is the technical dimension, is how we can make AI be more transparent, explainable, and ethical. At the same time, also, what are the social dimensions of AI development? Making sure that indeed it's, we have AI for good, AI generating positive benefit for the society, but also at the same time minimizing the potential risks and also the problems. One key dilemma that we always face in AI governance is that the regulatory system is always behind the technological change in AI development. So I think that's so-called pacing problem that's prevalent probably in all of the countries that we are actively engaged in AI development. So I think that's something that we have to recognize and also try our best to catch up. Now, let me move on to talk about AI development in China and AI governance in China. China's AI development, research and development has been moving very rapidly in recent years. On the left, you see that China's peer-reviewed publication has surpassed US and Europe. And the private investment in China also is quite active. It's second to the US. In terms of AI governance in China, China issued a policy statement in 2017 on AI development. And also the same year, China established a strategic advisory committee. And also 2 years later, established an AI committee, expert committee for AI governance. And I chair that committee. And in the same year that we developed a set of the AI governance principles that was published in June of that year, that here we focus on responsible AI, focus on harmony and human-friendly, fairness and justice, inclusion and sharing, and so on. So these are the major principles we follow. I think one thing that we did mention to the so-called agile governance, recognizing the pacing problem. So we want to make sure that indeed our governance principles will also change according to the AI development. In practice, now we're moving forward in developing further some industrial guidelines and standards. So China's IT Security Standards Committee has recently issued a guideline for companies to follow. And also, I think in different application areas, there are also many various kind of guidelines and regulations being developed in different locations. For example, the autonomous driving, different regions have already set various policies. And also, I think there are, the general public also has broader issue about the legal cases on facial recognition and so on. And that indeed, I think the court was ruled, I think, based on the principles that we proposed. And at company levels, it's much more active. In many companies, they have really set up various mechanisms for AI governance, such as the internal ethical review committee, and also, I think, various guidelines in their internal practice. Now, let me move on to international AI governance. I think this is very critical, I think, for this community. I think for China, China is a very active supporter of better international AI governance. First of all, I think that AI can be a very powerful tool to promote human progress, but also there's a need for coordination. So I think this is really a common good that that benefits all of us. And also, I think that the second point of cooperation for development, we recognize that AI development involves many cross-cutting issues, such as open source algorithms, data flow, cybersecurity, scientific collaboration, trade, and so on. So there's really need for global coordination and really addressing common issues. The third is that there are, while we have all this positive aspect, but also AI can have a devastating impact on human societies, such as the large autonomous weapon systems and so on. And so it's unlikely going to be addressed by a single country. In many cases, maybe not even sovereign countries. Various kind of groups can bring harm to the global society. And so we really wanted to make sure that we prevent a race to the bottom phenomenon in this area that leads to new arms race and other bad outcome. And also we recognize that indeed, different countries may have different views, different values, and so on. So the critical issue is how actually in this process of providing better international AI governance, we can reconcile our differences. So here again, I think the global cooperation, I think it's very, very important. So without deliberate efforts, it will be very hard to reach a consensus at the global level. So I think those are the, very broad set of reasons that we need to promote international AI governance and do that very quickly. In terms of specific Chinese positions on AI, international AI governance, China has always been, wanted to work with other countries and with international communities to really push on this front, to promote AI for good, to develop AI applications in various sectors, and also at the same time to work with our international partners to study, the potential risks and also potential social impacts to see how we can minimize the negative part of the social impact. And also China wants to maintain open development, promote international collaboration, and particularly we want to oppose decoupling because we do see some phenomenon that indeed some countries or groups of countries are trying to set up sort of small circles so the AI governance at the international level. I think excluding many of the critical players in AI development. I think the setting sort of bad precedents. I think that could lead to unwelcoming, consequences. So we really wanted to support inclusive rulemaking and support UN-based discussion and debates on governance principles, and we'll try to make sure that indeed all the views on critical issues are expressed fair level, and to make sure that indeed latecomers and all those different countries, their views are heard. And also we want to respect the laws and regulations of different countries, really making sure that we leave space for AI's rapid development. And finally, I think that in this AI governance international collaboration, we wanted to make sure that indeed private sector's voice are heard, particularly many multinationals. They do have a very high stakes in it, and also they can play important roles. So we want to make sure that they are included in this process. Finally, what are the steps for the international AI governance? I think, first of all, to establish inclusive global platform to coordinate AI governance issues are very critical. So I think the AI Congress, I think, is really doing a wonderful job in doing this. And secondly, I think that there's lots of things we can learn from other global governance issues. For example, the internet governance, the international system on nuclear arms control, on space law and climate change. All of those are really providing good lessons for AI international governance. And the third is that we need to strengthen scientific collaboration in AI research, including research on issues related to governance and social impact. I think they're actually looking at the research. I think there's a lot Actually, in terms of the AI technical research, there's a lot of international collaborations, including researchers in China and in the US. I think that really, I think we can learn from their efforts to make sure that indeed for people who study on the governance issues, also we engage in that cooperation. And the fourth is that we need to seek common values while respecting differences. We recognize that indeed, different countries have different values, different governance systems, but at the same time, as humans, as part of the human society, we do share some common values. I think those are really the foundation for the international AI governance. So we wanted to see what are those common values that can serve as a basis for international AI governance. But of course, we also recognize the social, economic, and political differences among countries. And finally, I think that based on those efforts, we can develop common principles and norms to really guide the healthy development and deployment of AI to make sure that indeed the AI's development can benefit human society, benefit sustainable development goals of the UN 2030 goals. So I think that's sort of what we hope we can see the next step in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. I very much agree with you on the problem of the gap between the speed with which technology is moving and the policy. But there's also, I think we need to look at the gap of adaptation. In other words, there's a gap between that speed and the ability both of humans and of organizations and of states to adapt quickly enough to these new technologies. Thank you very much, Professor, again. It's now my pleasure to introduce Konstantinos Karachalios, Managing Director of the IEEE Standards Association and member of the IEEE Management Council. Konstantinos, you have the floor.
Thank you. I have sent the presentation. Perhaps it can be uploaded. It is my pleasure to be here and address this audience. I think it is important to address the question of governance of these emerging technologies for the reasons I'm going to try to explain. Next slide, please. So, what are the key elements for such governance? Of course, we need a better governance in the cyberspace. And I cannot explain now all the aspects, but probably you understand what I mean. And AI is an important part, is becoming an important part of the intelligence of the cyberspace. Secondly, there are many actors, and we have to work together. And these actors tend to not cooperate with the others. So we have to break this. And this is one of the reasons that IEEE has engaged really not only in technical standards, but also in a very large-scale effort to build bridges with policymakers. I was just in a panel with the European Parliament right now, and I realized that all the institutions that were there were working intensively with them. So, and this is part of our role, how we see ourselves. We want to create, to add a layer of self-reflection within the techno-scientific communities that will help us do a better job from the beginning. This means assuming our share of responsibility and in the same time engaging with the other actors, the business world, the policymakers, so that we can, at least the ones who understand what we're talking about here, we can work together. We don't try to convert the enemies, we try to build alliances with the ones who understand. So, next slide, please. Next, so here it is a very short presentation because we're not just a standards organization, we're part of something much bigger, which is the IEEE. We're part of a global communities which are local also everywhere. So, I mean, I was in Tsinghua and talking with Sulan because of this recently. This is how we know each other. It is not because we are making standards. It's because we are part of what I would call a global democracy of technical experts. And this is something very interesting. Next slide, please. So the way we address these big issues and challenges is we create communities. So we started by creating a global community, a global initiative to address these questions that we are talking about today. And we did it years ago. Practically, we brought these things into the heart of the technical communities. Wendell and other people were really writing about this, but they could not reach our hearts. This is what we are doing now. And this is a change. And this is a positive one, I think. And these global communities we are establishing, they create really these things like the ethical aligned design, which probably many of you know, which is our Bible, to put it like this. And very interestingly, IEEE, which never takes position about the things that happen through IEEE, took here position and endorsed this. This was the first time in the history of IEEE. So this is another thing, let's say, indication that things are changing. And of course, it is not enough to be self-aware. We have to find the tools how to translate this self-awareness into practical tools, into systems design. And this is what we do with our standards. And this is a very powerful form of governance. Just to give you an example, many of the standards in this area about federated learning, about how to respect privacy while really training AI systems and so on, they come from people who live and work in China. And by doing this, we are creating this that Professor Su Lan was trying to explain. We create this global consensus bottom up. And this is also, in my opinion, although it looks technical, it is deeply political, but at a different level and very substantial one. It is not geopolitics. It is about caring about our future as human species on this planet. Next slide, please. And we do, so other things we do, so we create certification schemes that allow companies and also governments and also administration like municipalities to assess the quality of their AI systems with respect to their level of transparency, to accountability, reduction of bias, privacy, and so on. So we have done this already, and we are now working on use cases. So anyone who's interested, please contact me. I cannot go into details here. But not only this, it is about a paradigm change within the techno-scientific communities. Because if we do not change ourselves, the others have really no chance. Because of this discrepancy of the pace that Su Lan has shown, these curves, they go apart. So, and we have really to build alliances. And IEEE has really taken a protagonistic role in creating international fora. We can all work together to address this, like Oceanis, which is an open forum of many standardization organizations and industry who understand now the need to address what I call contextual issues, not only technical in standards. And this is really also a change. And also we create other forum like the Council on Extended Intelligence, and I cannot go into details here. Please contact me if you want to find out more about these things. Next slide, please. And for instance, we have created a team that thinks and works around the questions of power, concentration of power and technology. And these are all open, let's say, groups. Everybody can join who is interested. There are extremely interesting people participating here. And what we do is very influential. I think it is not a coincidence that you see a proliferation of AI principles which look all very similar. Next slide, please. And of course, one of our main priorities is to educate ourselves. It is not to educate others. It is about ourselves. If we lose this battle within our communities, then I don't think that we're helping anybody. So we have to educate the young engineers already in the curricula and also the young professionals. But it is not only about abstract education. It is not about motherhood and apple pie. It is about creating the tools that enable these people to do a better job from the beginning. It is about design. It is about guidance to design. And we have really standards that help people do this. Next slide, please. Next slide. Here you see, let's say, just a sample of our technical standards around the algorithmic systems. Next slide. And this will be made available to all of you. It is about the impact standards, which is not just technology. It is technology plus something else. And I would like to just name one, the first one, the P7000, which is a model process for addressing ethical concerns during system design. I think the title says it all. And this is our flagship standard. It is now close to maturity. I hope it will be released this year. Next slide, please. And we have also standards which come very close to the title of your seminar or your webinar today. We have a recommended practice for organizational governance of artificial intelligence. Many of the people who are really work here and leading this are participating today in your seminar. This is chaired by Gary Marchand, who I suppose many of you should know. And there is a very strong group. There are a lot of people who are interested here. And I hope we will conclude this early next year. So next slide, I think this was my last one. And I didn't want to steal more of your time. I just want to convey again this message. Governance cannot be just political. It is a very complex phenomenon. And the main actors need to come together and work together. And the techno-scientific communities, we are an actor, and we are here assuming our set of responsibility, and we are ready to engage with the others because we cannot do it alone. We have to understand the point of view of the others and work together to achieve a better governance of these technological systems, which are very critical because they are pervasive and invasive in our everyday life. It is about democracy. It is about the mental health of our children. So it is about our future.
Thank you very much, Konstantinos. I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you. That was really quite important to stress again the need to work together. And if we don't, clearly we're not going to make it. I now hand over to Nanjira, who will take us through the rest of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And Konstantinos' presentation is a really good segue to the three other presentations we're going to have that start to show us how we need to look at different actors and how they're coming at this question of governance to have the technical and the social meet to create cohesive governance. So it is my pleasure to introduce Anand Rao, who is the Global Artificial Intelligence Lead at PwC and Partner and Innovation Lead in PwC's advisory practice, who will give us some insights on corporate self-governance in a pre-recorded presentation.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this session on AI corporate self-governance. As a founding member of the International Congress for the Governance of AI, I want to really commend Jim and his team for bringing this group together to discuss some of these issues. What we wanted to do today is to go over the why, what, who, and how of AI corporate self-governance. First, look at why we want to govern AI. What does it really mean when we say AI governance, and who should be involved, and how exactly to perform these things, all coming in very much from the corporate perspective, I should add. So let's just address the question of why. And I'm sure every one of you have seen a number of articles, press releases in the recent past where a number of risks of AI have been highlighted. We have taken a very methodical approach to these risks, and you'll see 6 categories of risks here. And the 3 on the left are very application-specific risks, and 3 on the right are much more business level and societal risks. On the application level risks, everyone has heard about bias, various types of errors, overfitting, underfitting of models, opaqueness of models. That's one class of risks, and AI models and machine learning models fall under this trap of bias. The second list of risks are much more around security risks, a combination of cyber and AI, elements of stealing of the information from models, and a number of other areas of security concerns. The third bucket is more around control. How does the transfer of control between the humans and the machines work? When does the human take control or the machine take control of certain key decisions, and how does that interaction really happen? All of those are areas of risk, and these are risks that are happening today that we want to make sure we are mitigating some of those risks. On the right-hand side, you see a much broader set of risks around ethical risks, alignment of values of the AI, economic risks in terms of job displacement and how AI is augmenting or displacing jobs, and finally some of the risks that we have seen in terms of deep fakes, misinformation, and more societal risks around autonomous weapons and other areas. So all of these risks need to be taken into account and mitigated while we are also building up and exploiting the benefits of AI. So that's the reason why we want to govern the data and the AI models that use them. Now, you might ask, so what does it really mean to be governing AI? So what exactly are we talking about here? Here is a very quick framework on what we call as responsible AI, which encompasses AI governance. So on the left-hand side, you very much see a societal and an ethical viewpoint starting from the top, where number of researchers, number of professional institutions, policymakers, national bodies have come up with various principles of data, principles for ethics, and so on. And some of them are being translated into regulations as we speak. So there is one body of work which very much starts at the ethics and at the broader societal level. Then we get into a number of areas which we are calling more technical areas, where there are specific things that you can do from a data science AI perspective to check on other models. So models are being built, and there are ways of making sure that they are mitigating some of these risks. So some of the risks that we just looked at earlier: bias and fairness, explainability and interpretability of models, safety and security of models, robustness, privacy. All of those are very technical areas. And finally, the use of AI is very much a socio-technical system. So humans and machines collaborate and solve certain problems. So we need to make sure that there is AI governance, where people are looking at the processes from an end-to-end perspective, from a top-down perspective within an organization. And all of this together is responsible AI. So AI governance is one aspect of it, trying to mitigate some of the risks and also staying true to the overall ethics that the organization has adopted. As we move forward, we look at, so who should be involved in this AI governance? Is it just the corporates? Is it the government? Is it a combination? And what exactly should be done as to who is involved in AI governance? So here, again, we look at three groupings or three classes of institutions looking at it. One coming from the top down, what we call as the top down approach, very much a policymaker, regulatory driven approach. Again, it's just not the national governments. We see a number of bodies, professional bodies like IEEE, and also multinational bodies like the World Economic Forum, the UN, OECD, all groups now talking about AI and how to operationalize AI. So that comes in very much from a hard law perspective, where you are actually going to have some regulations in some of these areas, or very much on a guideline, so soft law perspective, what should the companies be doing and various types of companies or technologies should be doing. So that's very much a top-down, while we also have a bottom-up approach. A number of technology companies, as well as some of the companies that are using these technologies, are all coming up with various types of self-regulation, whether it is testing of the models, whether it is bias and fairness, or certain methodological processes, and so on. They're coming up with this. So both these should meet, and we should tie the two together, and that's sort of the middle out approach. How do we do the framing from a legal perspective, but then allow different frameworks and tools of different vendors to coexist, all satisfying some of the key things that we just looked at. Again, AI for people, another body, it really looks at this as no regret actions coming from the top and much more of an engagement coming in from the corporates and the need to build these things using various types of coordination mechanisms. So at the end of the day, we need all of these forces to come together to be able to define what we want in terms of governance. So there are a number of national strategies. The national strategies look far more than just regulation. So it's much more around protecting consumer data, protecting businesses, looking at the safety, security of people, but then also reskilling. So if jobs get displaced or changed, how do we actually get more people to be skilled? And also, how do we use AI for the benefit of all? And the policy areas typically split into these 6 areas: academic partnerships, national preeminence, so basic AI R&D. All of those areas are things that the national policy areas address, in addition to some very specific areas in either security, national security, healthcare, and some specialized AI. So these are the things the national policy documents look at, and that's how they are coming into the notion of AI governance. So now, moving back into the corporate world, how do you actually perform AI governance? What we have done, we as well as a number of other companies have come up with translating all of the broad set of principles into something really actionable. And we have defined 10 different principles that encompasses the responsible AI framework that we looked at earlier. So the first and foremost is aligning the principles and practices to your organization. Of course, there are a number of those documents here, but what really is relevant for your strategy, for your customers, for what you are delivering, and the gravity of the decisions that the AI is making dictate some of those. Then you go into the governance aspect, the top-down end-to-end governance, and a number of those technical areas that we looked at in terms of robustness, control, respect, transparency, security, and so on. At the end of the day, it is all needs to be accountable, and that's where the governance comes in. And we want to foster much more of a social and environmental well-being, essentially looking at a much broader concepts than just the accuracy of your model. So these are the principles of responsible AI. And what we need to do is embed them into what we call as an end-to-end governance. So right from the time that someone decides that there needs to be something where an AI solution is needed, to what data we have and so on, we call this a 9-step process, all the way to building those models, deploying them in real time, and then also continuously monitoring them. Some of those key questions that need to be addressed by business data scientists are highlighted there. So all these principles should align with these 6 stage gates, and also it should be targeted towards mitigating some of those risks that we talked about. So this is sort of a framework that we use for governing AI, for people building the models and people inspecting, people using these models. So that's what we mean by AI governance. And obviously there's a number of details here. So from this 9-step process, typically what happens is you go into each one of those stage gates and you see a number of different things happening here as to who is responsible for doing some of these business understanding, solution design, what is the document that they produce, and who is actually approving those, what is the escalation process. So governance is all about what decisions are being made, who is making those decisions, and what information are they using to make those decisions, and how does the escalation process happen. And that's what we are trying to set up here from a data science perspective, but then from a business, C-level, and a board level perspective. So essentially going this end to end, but also going from the bottom, which is the data science, all the way to the top, and outside as well to the consumer and to the regulators, right? So you really need to be thinking about governance in this 360 view. And that's what we mean by AI governance. So very quickly to summarize, AI governance is required to mitigate some of the risks. There's a huge number of those risks like bias, fairness, security, safety. And a combination of a top-down and a bottom-up approach is required, and it requires all different bodies to come together, the public, private, not-for-profit, professional bodies, global institutions like UN, ICGAI, and so on, to provide that guidance and provide that regulation, provide the frameworks, tools, all of that. And operationalizing AI ethics from principle to practice also requires a number of methodologies, tools, frameworks that's all emerging from the academic community as well as from the vendor technology community. So all these things need to come together, and obviously we need some standardization, and that's what we are here for, to bring these things together. So with that, I would like to complete my talk here, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Anand, for taking us into a very interesting deep dive on how corporate sector may be coming at this question. So next we will hear from Hilary Sutcliffe, who's Director of Society Insight and Take Tech, and who is a former co-chair of World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Technology, Values, and Policy. Hilary's is also a recorded presentation.
Thank you. And it's an honor to be part of this really important conference. I'd like to start with the roots of distrust. Our research has shown that the biggest driver of distrust is when companies, politicians, regulators particularly, appear to prioritize the making of money over people and planet. And secondly, the way that institutions and legal approaches aren't really equipped for values judgments or ethical and moral issues. A sort of governance regime that's really predicated on health and safety, jump through this hoop and all will be well, and stop and do that and we'll fine you, doesn't actually set itself up well for some of the really critical values judgments we find with artificial intelligence, facial recognition, and ethical and moral issues. And thirdly, that governance institutions, and that includes companies, but also regulators and government, are aloof and secretive and opaque. And they don't really show their priorities and how they go about their decision-making. So those are the three roots of distrust in governance. And I'd like to share with you as well three findings of our research that are important to trust in governance. Because when we started this project and when Conrad came to me with this idea, I sort of thought, yeah, trust in governance, yeah, that's really interesting. It wasn't until I really did the work that I saw how important people's trust in governance and regulation is. And it's pivotal to their trust in the technology itself. And a perfect example of that is the trustworthiness and trust in the approvals process and the decision-making around COVID vaccines. That's actually been just as important as trust in the vaccines themselves. Because citizens trust governance when they see that it's working, you know, when they're holding public interest, punishing those at fault and rewarding those who are doing good things. And at the moment with AI, it looks as if companies and regulators are failing that #1 distrust test, and that the tech is really moving forward without thinking and considering the values and ethics of society. And it's really important to the system of a whole that citizens do and can trust governance. And what does that look like? We had a great quote in some of the consultation work that we did. Someone said to me, I don't know why you're doing this project. If something bad happens, I'm going to hear about it on the news. That is what trust in governance is about. The system works, I don't have to worry about it. And we see in AI at the moment that actually the system isn't working and people are worried about it. So let's say where to start. You have bought this idea that trust and governance is important, whether you're a company or a regulator. And I'd like to draw on the great and simple quote of Baroness Honora O'Neill, who is a philosopher of trust. And she says, how to be trustworthy, how to be trusted. First, be trustworthy. And second, provide good evidence that you are trustworthy. That's really simple. That's so great. And so with that in mind, we started to look at what are the drivers of trust? What are the signals of trustworthiness and what matters to trust? And quite surprisingly, we found an unusual academic consensus, not about trust, which is all over the place. Evolutionary psychologists, sociologists, political scientists, behavioral scientists, all have a hugely different idea about what is trust. But what there is consensus on are these signals of trustworthiness. And I'd like to show you here what these 7 signals of trustworthiness are. They are intent. You have a good intent. And from the governance point of view, you have an intent that is in the public interest. And that's upheld through purpose, through process, through delivery. You have competence, and the OECD has got a great quote. It's all very well having good intent, but if you're incompetent, really that doesn't count either. You will not be trusted. And part of the qualities of that competence are reliability, effectiveness, and responsiveness, which is particularly important. And there are sort of 5 values components to these signals of trustworthiness. Respect, almost could trash everything else and put respect first and center, because seeing others as equals, listening to and taking seriously their concerns and views and rights, and considering the potential impact of your work, of your governance, of your innovation on others, is a pivotal driver of trust. Openness, we hear a lot about transparency and openness, but is really critical, particularly now. Real radical openness is quite important and is seen as really effectiveness in terms of driving trust. Integrity, which we look at as well as accountability, about operating honestly, and also being independent of vested interests. Fairness is enshrined in justice and equality in governance processes in all sorts of governance, from international instruments to just the way we deal with each other. It's not fair is really a visceral feeling in most of our minds. And I think fairness is an important part that we see in AI. Is it fair? Is it fair to these different constituencies? How do we make it more fair? And I see that a lot in lots of the ethical frameworks, but very interestingly, inclusion. So this idea of working collaboratively to design governance, working collaboratively to shape the trajectory of your technology, that is a pivotal part of trustworthiness, involving others. Finally, we could think here of trust and trustworthiness a bit like an iceberg. Trust is made up of hundreds of accumulated acts of trustworthiness based on those little signals. And that's underneath the surface. That goes on behind the scenes. It's about how you run things. It's about how your decision making. It's about how the way your organization works. And above that surface, the iceberg itself is the evidence of trustworthiness. And a lot of talk about trust talks about communications. It's about PR, it's about messaging. And we would say that trust is very much about the evidence of your trustworthiness, not just good PR. But as you'll see here, there is the weather, the things that shape the iceberg, that shape the technology, that shape the governance. And that is culture, it's media, it's changing norms, it's context. It's all of these things that actually make that a very complex and difficult and challenging way to earn trust. It's not just this equation of you do this, you do that, and trust will come out of the sausage machine. It's both a science and it's an art to get trustworthiness, to earn the trust of society. And those are the key findings of our Trust in Governance project. If you'd like to know more, a slide here will show you just where to go to our dedicated website. And please give me a call at any time, and very happy to talk further about it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that contribution, Hilary. I mean, I'm sure many of us will be referring to the website to just think about this a lot more as we really conceptualize what trustworthy AI looks like. Well, last but not least, we have the pleasure of hearing live from Merv Hickok, who's a senior researcher at the Center for AI and Digital Policy and founder at AIethicist.org. Merv, over to you.
Thank you so much, and give me a second to share my screen. And if you can let me know if you're able to see that. Can you give me a nod if you're able to see the presentation?
Yes, a confirmation now.
All right, thank you so much. So thanks a lot, and it's really honored to be here today. And I see a lot of familiar faces both on the panel as well as the participants. Today, I would like to share some of the work that we are doing at Center for AI and Digital Policy, and listening to the sessions ahead of me, I think we're going to be able to, I'll be able to tie some of the work as well. So a couple of months ago, working in the, couple of months ago, our team at Center for AI and Digital Policy, by the way, apologies for the background, grandfather's clock. Our teams at Center for AI and Digital Policy, working under the auspices of Michael Dukakis Institute in collaboration with the AI World Society and Boston Global Forum, has published the AI and Democratic Values AI Social Contract Index 2020 report. It is the first kind of its comparative report on national AI policies and practices, where we looked at 30 countries for their endorsement of OECD AI principles, human rights conventions, and social contract for the AI age. We compared those against the endorsements against actual implementations in each country. And what we found was, when we were looking at actual practices, which were mainly public sector implementations, we noted that a number of the national AI strategies make reference to human rights and OECD AI principles. However, there's still a significant gap between the written commitment and the actual implementation. There was a striking number of countries committing themselves to experimenting with AI, test bedding or data collection and sharing practices between public and private entities, which makes the question of this governance even more crucial. So like I said, we reviewed 30 countries, 12 metrics, and ranked the countries within 5 tiers. 30 countries, 25 of these by GDP, and we included 5 impact countries like Singapore and Rwanda within the report. In each country section, we provide the details of implementations that we reviewed and what the country could do to further move towards a more democratic implementation of AI. On one end, you're seeing, on like tier 1 end, you're seeing robust safeguards, AI leadership, public participation. On the other end of the spectrum, you're looking at countries who could or which might need to develop or enhance their policies and governance structures against these metrics. One of the findings that we had was, some of the findings that we had was the OECD and G20 AI guidelines were influential in shaping a lot of these national AI strategies. We identified a number of red lines for AI, such as usual facial recognition for mass surveillance, criminal sentencing, or scoring of the citizens. In a number of countries, we found that NGOs were impactful in terms of shaping the national AI strategies and shaping some of the public implementations of the AI technologies. And one of our final findings was that AI policy and regulation is in its early days, but the pace is certainly accelerating. I'm looking at both ends of the AI debates on both ethics as well as the policy, and the policy side definitely needs to catch up with some of the conversations we have. As a team, we also had a concern when we were doing this report and with some of our other engagements. Although we accomplished an incredible feat of comparing 30 countries, we acknowledge the fact that the representation of global South countries was not enough. And we committed to expanding our coverage in 2021 report, as well as monitoring of AI policy developments. So to that end, we have introduced a number of new initiatives that you can find at our website. One is public policy. In this segment, we promote public participation in AI policy. We monitor different countries and see which policy statements or legislation that they open for public comment, and kind of provide that curated list to those interested. We also have CIIDP's Center for AI and Digital Policy's own statements against these policy initiatives that you can find on the website. The updates piece provides significant AI policy developments globally. Again, this is to support the regions, especially the regions that are not usually heard, to be able to share these updates, significant policy updates in a central space. So we are having a more global approach to it. And finally, AI policy events. I tend to see a lot of AI ethics conversations and events. In fact, this is my second event with Lord Timms today. We're discussing a lot of stuff on the AI side, but AI policy events themselves seem to be or tend to be a lot rarer. So again, this is a part of our website, part of our initiative that you can find and be able to follow the policy events. Some of these policy items that we are covering closely in 2021 are already mentioned by different panelists in different sessions. But if you are contributing to any of these and would like to discuss or would like to provide further insights, please connect with us at Center for AI and Digital Policy. And finally, I would like to mention another initiative, this one spearheaded by Boston Global Forum, is how can we create a artificial intelligence international accord. So to be able to do that and move to an international partnership and alliance, we're looking to build consensus around the framework for an international accord on AI standards, and then establish a democratic alliance on that and its companion document, Social Contract for the AI Age. Social Contract for the AI Age is grounded in the idea that AI should protect fundamental rights, that systems should be implemented in a transparent and accountable way, and that they're considered from a multi-stakeholder perspective to achieve a fair and equitable global community. It was one of our metrics in our index report. So this is, like I said, another initiative by Boston Global Forum to move this conversation forward and actually have a global alliance on the social side. And the final piece is how can we create a monitoring system to observe the uses as well as abuses of AI by governments and businesses? How can we track and share this for a better governance and keep the governments as well as businesses accountable for their stand as well as their practices? And I'll stop there, and if any questions, please feel free to contact me.
Marv, thank you very much. And with that, we come to the end of today's presentations, which have been very rich, very diverse, lots to ruminate on. I'll hand over to Wendell to just give us a sense of what is to come and what he makes of all of this.
Thank you ever so much, Nanjira. This has truly been a remarkable series of talks. And I trust that for all of you, you will be leaving with a very rich sense of the breadth of things going on in the international governance of AI, but also a rich sense of what's not been dealt with yet and really requires some attention. I won't repeat some of the most obvious themes, but I do want to mention at least one of them, that this patchwork quilt of principles and policies is inadequate and we need a 21st century mechanism to ensure effective and trustworthy AI governance. We need to ensure that we put that in place, and it's a truly inclusive mechanism. Yes, we do have a few initiatives that portend to move in that direction, but I think we also know that each of them has strengths and weaknesses, and there's much more to be done. Now, something that gets lost in these discussions around AI governance is the cross-fertilization of ideas and proposals and the manner in which they've been evolving over time through collective engagement and participatory intelligence. This is so often lost as individuals and institutions clamor for primacy. So our project over this 5 years, it was already building on so much work by scholars, by reformers in international governments, by critics of existing multilateralism. And there were many proposals that would already been put forward, and they fed into the creation of some of the initiatives you have been hearing about. They fed into work at the World Economic Forum. They fed into the work of the Secretary General's higher level panel on digital cooperation, which had an output of recommending that we create some kind of a multi-stakeholder advisory body. Now, as we were formulating policy recommendations for the Congress, which was to have convened in Prague, and it's so sad that we are limited to making presentations and not sitting together and engaging over these issues and struggling with how collectively we can move forward. We did have these 3 experts working groups. One of them was graciously organized and hosted for us by Eileen Donahoe, who's the executive director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford University's Cyber Policy Center. So at that meeting, we had about 20 to 25 experts from around the world representing different governments, representing Microsoft and Google and academics who had put forward some new proposals. And we came up with one proposal, which has already been echoed over and over again, a proposal for a global governance network. Now, again, it was recognized from the get-go that the governance of AI globally will be distributed, but there did not seem yet to be a mechanism in place that would facilitate adequate cooperation between all the stakeholder groups, not just governments and the tech oligopoly, but also those whose lives were to be affected by AI implementations and yet had very little input on what systems would and would not be put in place. The Global Governance Network, the ideas that led to that, also fed into many of these other initiatives, as I've been saying. One of the outputs was that of the Secretary General's higher level committee panel's recommendation for a multi-stakeholder advisory body. And that has been furthered as we have moved from recommendations to the Secretary General's digital roadmap for digital cooperation. So it looks very similar to what we were putting forward. The question that's still outstanding is, will that body be put in place and will it be effective? Certainly all of us recognize that the UN would be the correct place for such a full engagement of the world community. And yet we're also very mindful of the way in which some of the multilateral structures in place at the UN have hamstrung effective governance in so many different areas. So a question that I'll leave you with is whether or not we can make the UN's Secretary General's initiative robust, or whether it will need to be complemented by activity in other initiatives, or whether we may even need to create a new international body that not only complements what's going on in the UN, but perhaps facilitates some of the activities that the UN or other global initiatives such as GPI are not able to take up alone and speak for the world community as a whole. The second part of all of this is, how do you ensure that such a body is meaningfully inclusive in the governance of the AI revolution? And there have also been many recommendations to create international governance networks that from the bottom up elect their own representatives to international bodies, those whom they trust collectively and whom they believe can speak for their stakeholder groups and will be trusted by the others who sit in this global governance network, whether that's within the UN, another body, or something totally new. And that's what we're going to focus on a little bit more in our next meeting on April 13th. We're going to bring together and talk about meaningful inclusivity in the governance of the AI revolution with talks and panels from a variety of stakeholder groups. And then at the end, we hope to have a conversation about whether the Secretary General's initiative can be made robust, whether one of the other initiatives can truly represent the world community in an even-handed way, or whether we might need to be creating some new complementary bodies. So I invite you all to join us on April 13th. And with that, let me return the floor to Nanjira.
Thank you, Wendell. Thank you for encapsulating some really interesting ways for us to think and ruminate over what we've heard today. Mine is really now just to give a very hearty appreciation for all our presenters and speakers, many of whom are still on the screen right now. Thank you so much. It is in itself a very interesting experiment on whether this is the kind of governance and inclusive way we can bring different actors to the table as we're talking about. So we very much appreciate your input. And again, just re-emphasizing that we look forward to seeing you all back on April 13th. Michael, I don't know if you have a final word as well for our great audience here.
Thank you, Nanjira. Yes, I do. First of all, what a terrific few hours. This has been great. But I just want to say a few words about the fact that what we're trying to do and the way this convergence that we've seen in all of the talks today situates itself very much in the much broader transition of governance that we are living right now, and have done for a while, but which has been vastly accelerated by the pandemic, and particularly with the leapfrogging of technology into our lives. So what I've heard today really gives me hope, because while we were focusing on the governance of AI, we were in effect also talking about governance in general, a new model of governance that is much more integrated, that is much more collaborative, that is de-siloed, and that is, more than anything else, is networked. It's only by creating these new structures and by reinventing, if you want, multilateralism in that sense, that we're going to make it, and that we're going to deal with the existential problems that are facing us, including how we're going to govern and put some order into the way that technology is being deployed, and how it affects the lives of people, and how we use it, both in terms of ethics and in terms of human rights, in terms of applying the Sustainable Development Goals in an equitable way, and one that is makes sure that we leave no one behind, and we ensure that everybody is the beneficiary of this. So I'm really must thank you all and congratulate you all for this. I think there's much hope in the way this is moving forward. And I look forward to see you all on the 13th together with Nanjira and beyond. But because I think that, as somebody said earlier on, it's no longer the time for just talk. We really need to get our act together collectively and start putting in place some of these great ideas that are coming out. Ideas that will be applicable not just for the governance of AI, but for governance in general. Thank you so much, and see you soon.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much.